Imagine that one day you wake up in a strange apartment. Everything is too big. The chairs come up to your chest, the doorknobs are at eye level, and the ceilings are lost somewhere in the darkness. You feel that this place was not created for you. This is exactly what our world looks like. We just got so used to it that we stopped noticing it. On every continent, in dozens of cities, from the banks of the Neva to the desert of the Middle East, monumental stone pillars rise. They stand completely alone, without any logical connection to the surroundings. The guides recite learned formulas about the triumphs of emperors and the glory of generals. Academics nod their heads and conclude the topic with one sentence. It is a decoration, a symbol of power. But stop for a moment and ask yourself a fundamental question that no professor will ask you. Who in their right mind devotes decades of work and a fortune comparable to the budget of a small country to build a multi-ton stone pillar that serves absolutely no purpose? It's as if you built a bridge over a river that doesn't exist. This doesn't make any sense unless someone is systematically lying to us about what these structures really were. Today we will take apart one of the most closely guarded mysteries of our past. We will talk about stone giants, which, contrary to all laws of physics and logic, protrude in the very center of our cities. And we pass by them every day without understanding what we are really looking at. I guarantee you one thing. After this section, every granite column you pass on your walk will send a shiver down your neck. You will no longer see the decoration. You will begin to see the mechanism perhaps still working. Let's start with the hard data, the ones that anyone can verify, but that no one wants to put together. Let's take a flagship example. A monumental granite pillar standing on the main square of St. Petersburg. The official account says that in 1834 a talented architect named Montferrand designed a clever system of ramps and rope pulleys and put thousands of soldiers of the Tsarist army to work. A story as beautiful as a fairy tale with one minor flaw is physically impossible. The core of this pillar itself is a uniform piece of granite weighing more than 600 tons. So that you have a point of reference, that's roughly the weight of 10 fully loaded freight cars, or 3 fully fueled and equipped jumbo jets. 600 tons. Monolithic block without any connections, no joints, no screws. Now let's take a calculator instead of an album with romantic illustrations. Hemp rope, the only material allegedly available to builders of that era, has a precisely defined tensile strength. Count how many such ropes are needed to lift 600 tons and how many pairs of hands must hold them at the same time. The result is devastating. You would need such a crowd of people that it would not physically fit in any square in St. Petersburg. People would stand so tight they couldn't even lift their arms. Modern engineering companies, equipped with hydraulic actuators, steel cables and computer modeling of loads, treat moving 100 tons as a high-risk special operation. And we are treated to a story about cheerful soldiers with hemp strings. These colorful engravings from the era, which show happy little people pulling ropes, are not technical documentation. It's visual propaganda, drawn after the fact to create a plausible explanation for something that requires a completely different explanation. But transportation is only half the puzzle. The second half is even more uncomfortable. Someday, go up to one of these columns and touch its surface. You will feel a smoothness that you will not find even on modern kitchen countertops. This is mirror polishing of granite, a mineral that is close to diamond on the Mohs hardness scale. Obtaining such a texture manually would require decades of continuous work by skilled craftsmen, rubbing the surface with successive fractions of abrasive. But it's not just about smoothness. It's about geometry. These pillars have the shape of ideal solids of revolution, cylinders, or gentle cones with a tolerance of deviations measured in fractions of a millimeter over the entire multimeter length. Any mechanical engineer will tell you without hesitation. A solid of revolution with such parameters can be created only by one method. by rotating the detail around its own axis while cutting the material. In other words, you need a lathe. A lathe capable of holding and turning a workpiece weighing 600 tons. Not a stylus or a wooden hammer, but an industrial machine with dimensions that will shock even a modern technologist. Under appropriate lighting, regular, spiral marks can be seen on the surface of these pillars. Typical signature of machining. But history books stubbornly repeat the mantra about the manual work of simple people. The absurdity deepens when we look at the map. Technologically identical objects stand in Luxor, in the ruins of Baalbek, in modern Lebanon, among ruins of the Eternal City, in Alexandria, in Paris. The official chronology scatters them over thousands of years and attributes them to completely different cultures. Some were allegedly built by the pharaohs, others by Caesar's legions, and still others by the Tsar subjects. And yet, the nature of the processing, the proportions, the choice of raw material and tool marks are identical everywhere, as if someone was working according to one technical specification, one industrial standard applicable all over the world. What does this mean? That either there was one unified production standard spanning the entire planet, or the official chronology is fiction and all these elements were created at a similar time as part of one civilization project on a scale we cannot imagine. Now let's ask the key question. Why do these pillars stand alone? Why aren't they built into the walls? Don't they support the ceilings? Don't they connect with other elements? Why do we so often see small figurines, angels, crosses and statues on their tops, whose proportions are in no way do they not match the power and scale of the column itself? The answer suggests itself if we reject academic dogmas. These decorations on the gables are later additions. The people who came after they found these monumental pillars already standing, they didn't know what they were for and they did what humanity always does to things it doesn't understand. They turned them into objects of worship, inserted their religious symbols and wrote legends about their creation. This is a classic pattern. A new civilization appropriates the legacy of the previous one and proclaims it as its own achievement. Take these figurines down mentally. What do you see? Precisely smoothed, perfectly vertical stone cores reaching towards the sky. Some of them, like the famous Trajan's pillar, they have a spiral staircase inside, carved in solid marble. Consider the engineering complexity of such a task. Hollow out a perfect spiral inside a series of marble segments and fit them together with the precision required by modern CNC machining. Why such madness if it's just a monument? Why make it utilitarian on the inside if it's just going to be a symbol on the outside? We are faced with a conclusion that official science rejects with horror. These pillars were never monuments. They were components of a vast technical network stretching across the globe. Maybe they were supports for the demolished structures, or maybe they themselves served as devices, transmitters, batteries, atmospheric resonators. We have been led to believe that electricity is an invention of the last 200 years. But what if we merely rediscovered something that was widely available before us? What if these mineral towers are relics of the global energy infrastructure that we have ignorantly dubbed temples and monuments? Let's take a look at what they are made of. Granite is essentially a conglomerate of minerals, dominated by crystalline quartz, a material exhibiting the piezoelectric effect. When you subject quartz to mechanical pressure, it generates an electrical charge. 600 tons of granite is a colossal internal pressure acting on billions of quartz crystals. This is not a decorative stone. This is a potentially huge generator standing at a precisely defined geodetic point on the planet. Official science runs away from these questions, like a plague. Because if we admit that the St. Petersburg column could not have been built in the manner described by academic sources, the entire narrative of the 19th century will have to be plowed through. it will be necessary to say openly that there was a completely different level of technology and what happened to the people who operated them? Why was there a sudden break in the chain of knowledge transmission? The answers to these questions lead us to demographic anomalies and suspicious gaps in the archives, which we will return to later. For now, remember the starting thesis. Lone columns are indicators of forgery. This is tangible, physical evidence of the existence of an alternate past that someone carefully erased from our collective memory. And the deeper we dig, the more disturbing the picture becomes. We've only just peeled off the first piece of this facade, and I assure you, there's something lurking behind it that most of us are not prepared for. Now let's get into the material science and logistic details that will make every construction specialist's hair stand on end. Let's put aside the tourist brochures and reach for textbooks on mechanics, material resistance, and heavy transport. The official scenario for the construction of colonnades, Isaac's Cathedral, or the St. Petersburg Pillar fall apart at the first collision with physics. We are told that the granite was cut in the quarries of Karelia, loaded onto wooden rafts and floated down the rivers to the capital. Sounds logical until we check the numbers. A single column of the council weighs 114 tons. There are a total of 112. Add it up. Multiply by transport costs, reloading, process. You will receive a logistical operation that would exceed the budget of many modern countries. At the beginning of the 19th century, there were no railway routes adapted to such masses. The roads are barely packed dirt, which turned into a swamp after the first downpour. Mentally try to put a 100-ton block on a wooden cart and move it on wet clay. The wheels will sink right up to the hubs on the first turn. The pressure on the ground with such a load is crushing. To transport loads of this class, a rigid surface with a hard base is needed, i.e. infrastructure that, according to the official version, simply did not exist at that time. Now let's take a closer look at the material itself under magnification. Officially, these monoliths are natural stone cut from a rock massif. However, independent researchers taking photos of the macro surfaces of columns encounter peculiarities. Small bubbles trapped in the mass, resembling air bubbles frozen in liquid material, and in places a clear layering, an artificial stone made of mineral aggregate, binder, and water using a technology that the ancients mastered to perfection, and which we are just starting to reproduce in laboratories. If this is true, it solves several mysteries at once. Perfect shape without chisel marks, no need to transport from distant quarries, ability to create any large monoliths. They were not dragged hundreds of kilometers along muddy trails. They were poured on site, in formwork, just like we build monolithic skyscrapers today. But to accept this thesis is to admit that materials chemistry and composites technology in the distant past equaled, and perhaps exceeded, ours. Who provided these recipes to the builders of the supposed 19th century? Or maybe a more realistic scenario is that the columns have stood in these places since time immemorial, and architects like Montferrand only dealt with excavating them, cleaning them, and integrating them into the new surroundings. Pay attention to Giovanni's Graphics Piranesi Battisti from the 18th century. Art historians classify it as fan taste, a visionary drawing imaginary views. But why do these so-called fantasies look like a photo report? His copperplate engravings show panoramas of colossal buildings covered with vines, half covered with earth, among which small human figures in torn clothes move. These characters are clearly not builders. They are the tenants of the ruins. They light fires at the foot of titanic pillars, using fragments of the majestic architecture as makeshift furniture and shelters. It's a post-apocalyptic setting image of the world after a global cataclysm. These lonely columns scattered across the map are the bones of that lost order, the ribs of a vast structure of planetary proportions whose walls and ceilings have been blown away by the forces the scale of which we cannot comprehend. Let's move to Lebanon, to the monumental ruins of Baalbek. There, at the foundations of the so-called Temple Jupiter, rests megaliths known as trilithons, blocks of stone each weighing from 800 to over 1,000 tons. The official narrative attributes their arrangement to Roman legionaries. Let's stop here for a moment. The pinnacle of Roman crane mechanics was a wooden chain block powered by human muscles. Capable of lifting at most 50 to 60 tons. You see this cosmic difference between what these people could actually do and what lies on the construction site in Baalbek. To lift 1,000 tons, today's engineers need crawler cranes each the size of an apartment building strapped together, and the textbook explanation is ropes and wooden blocks. This isn't even a simplification. This is an open disregard of our ability to think logically. In addition, the quarry from which these blocks were allegedly extracted is located below the level of the temple. This means that 1,000-ton monoliths were not the only ones needed but move uphill, on sloping terrain. Calculate the force needed to overcome friction and inclination. Count the number of people who would have to pull at the same time. You will have a human column stretching for a kilometer that cannot be coordinated by any shout or drum signal. And here we come to a question that should bother every thinking person. Why this momentum? Why not build from smaller elements, from bricks, from smaller blocks, as is done everywhere where human hands are used? Why impose a terrible engineering complication on yourself? The answer is both simple and terrifying. For those who created it, it was no complication. This was their normal way of working. Handling a mass of 1,000 tons was as routine for them as building a wall of blocks was for us. This means that they either had machines with power that we cannot imagine, or they knew a way to manipulate weight, neutralize gravity, acoustic levitation, whatever, which our physics does not officially recognize. One thing is certain. These weren't people in sandals with wooden cranes. And look what's happening around these structures. To the giant pillars in Baalbek, in Egypt, in Rome, clumsy walls made of rough-hewn stone are often added, made of clay, from random materials. This is the real achievement of these civilizations that we know from the chronicles. They came ready. They moved into the ruins they found, they built their mud huts between the mighty columns of a bygone world like homeless people, occupying an abandoned factory. This is why the columns stand alone. Everything that held them together built by that great civilization ceased to exist. Only the most resistant elements, the structural spine, survived. We live in the era of recycling other people's achievements. We are a civilization of foragers who have developed ruins and included them in her own history as her works. So why does the scientific community maintain such deafening silence? Why is it that any researcher who dares to publicly talk about geopolymer concrete or the impossibility of manually grinding granite to a mirror shine is immediately branded a charlatan, because the stakes are incomparably higher than correcting the date of some historic building? The credibility of the entire edifice of official knowledge and the legitimacy of those who control this knowledge are at stake. Because if we assume that before us there was a civilization technically equal to or superior to us, a series of questions immediately arise that no one wants to answer. What destroyed her? Could this happen to us again? And who now holds the reins of this world, carefully hiding the truth about our real origins from us? Maybe we are not a wreath of progress after all, as we have been told for generations? Maybe we are the degenerate heirs of the survivors or, what's even more disturbing, a fresh population introduced into the cleared area. Take a look at maps from several hundred years ago. They show cities that do not exist today. Rivers flowing on different courses, land contours that do not match today's geography. This suggests that our planet's surface has been dramatically reshaped in relatively recent times. And the lonely columns are geodetic reference points, stone lanterns that have survived this global reshuffling of landscapes. And now we come to evidence that is not based on geology or the strength of materials, but on cold population numbers, on data that official historians avoid like poison. We are presented with panoramas of the mighty empires of the 19th century, an era of frantic construction and artistic flourishing. But when we reach for authentic demographic records from that period, we see an emptiness, an arithmetic impossibility. Take St. Petersburg or Paris from the middle of the same century. We are assured that these metropolises raised an army of hundreds of thousands of builders. But the official number of inhabitants in those decades was dramatically too small to justify the declared pace and scale of construction. To build a building of the type of the Council of Isaac or the Washington Capitol with the level of tools at that time, you need the economy of an industrial power and a multitude of specialized professionals who need to be fed, trained, and maintained for generations. Meanwhile, the world presents itself to us where 90% of the population are illiterate and live off farming. Where did the material and human resources come from? It's an economic paradox without a solution. Imagine that today's country without infrastructure, without roads, without power grid. Suddenly he starts building a NASA-class rocket complex with only blades. Sounds absurd? And this is precisely the absurdity that official historiography makes us believe. And here we reach a phenomenon that some independent researchers call the syndrome of extinct metropolises. Browse the earliest photographic images from the 1950s and 60s. 19th century. Paris, Moscow, St. Petersburg, Rome. Monumental facades, majestic perspectives, and ghost towns. Single, lonely human silhouettes, looking like lost figurines against the background of overwhelming decorations. Defenders of the official version reply, it's a matter of the long exposure time, people were moving and that's why they weren't captured. But the water in the rivers on the same films is razor sharp. The leaves of the trees are not blurred, and the supposedly bustling crowds of the capital city have disappeared. No, friends, it is not a fault with the equipment. It is a record of the moment of recolonization. We see the world immediately after the reset. Survivors or those who were resettled here, they enter deserted cities left behind by someone much bigger and more powerful. And suddenly the lonely columns gain their authentic identity. These are not emblems of military glory. These are the surviving components of the infrastructure network, built made of too durable material, so that a cataclysm could sweep them away. A cataclysm that some researchers call the Great Flood or Global Flood. Examine the foundations of these pillars. Excavations have repeatedly revealed that what we take to be the natural ground level is actually a multi-meter layer of mud. The columns extend far below the current surface and have no foundations in the classical sense. They're just buried in the clay, sand, and rubble. The Roman Forum was excavated from under meters of earth. Historical buildings in Moscow, Kazan, and Omsk have floors going underground with windows and doors hidden below the pavement. Attempts are made to explain this by the so-called cultural layer, i.e. the natural rise of the ground level over the centuries. The cultural layer is garbage that accumulates centimeter by centimeter over millennia. Here we are talking about entire floors buried under homogeneous clay sediment. It is the trace of a wave carrying millions of tons of soil. A wave with a continental range that crushed fragile buildings, but it failed to bring down these granite spikes. The lonely columns are trees that remained after the tsunami passed through the stone forest. The rest was washed away, and the new hosts who took over these areas, tidied up the surroundings, paved the squares and composed beautiful stories about their own constructions. And notice the issue of ergonomics, perhaps the most troubling aspect for the official narrative. The height of steps in so-called ancient temples, the size of door frames, the arrangement of handles and doorknobs in old cathedrals, which the average adult cannot reach without climbing on his toes. These buildings, of which our lonely columns were once an integral part, were not designed with us in mind. They were designed for creatures 3 or 4 meters tall. In these interiors we look like children playing in an adult's house. We are too small. These monumental arches, ceilings disappearing in darkness, gigantic window openings are not an expression of artistic megalomania. This is a functional dimension, tailored to users who do not exist today. Where did they go? Why are we the only ones left? Here we enter the darkest of hypotheses. Perhaps the history of humanity is a history of controlled selection. Recall the disproportionate number of orphanages and shelters that mushroomed in the 19th century. Thousands of children without identity, without parents, without roots. They were taught from scratch. They were given new names, a new one was instilled in them, a prepared version of history. We as a species could have been recreated in laboratory procedures or mass incubators after the previous civilization was eliminated. We are the next shift on planetary duty, and we have been handed a simplified reality manual so that we don't dig too deep. Lone columns remain as silent witnesses of this process. Nothing is attached to them, because all connectors, ceilings, spans and cladding were destroyed. We look at the frame itself. Imagine a modern skyscraper, from which the hurricane tore off the entire coating, windows, walls, and installations, leaving only bare, concrete load-bearing cores. In 1,000 years, the discoverers of these shafts will kneel before them and perform rituals, having no idea that they are kneeling in the ruins of an office building. That's exactly what we do today. We circle around technical construction elements, call them monuments, give them poetic names, and do not even realize that we are standing in the middle of a dismantled power plant or communication node. This thought is like a cold shower. It makes us feel small, manipulated, cut off from the truth, but at the same time it gives the key. If we accept the cataclysm hypothesis, population replacement and loss of technology, suddenly all historical contradictions are no longer contradictions. It becomes understandable why we cannot recreate a polygonal wall with a perfect fit. Why can't we bake bricks that are so durable? Why are we unable to file a lawsuit? A granite vase with paper-thin walls. We have not forgotten these skills. We never had them. Those who came before us and whose legacy we use so clumsily were able to do this. But the most fascinating thing is that traces of their technology have not completely evaporated. They are encoded in the architecture itself. Take a map of the globe and mark the location of all these monumental, lonely pillars on it. Then connect these points with straight lines. What you see will make your skin tingle. This is not a random scattering of monuments honoring various rulers. It is a precisely calibrated geometric mesh. The lines run across the land and ocean, creating regular triangles and polygons with striking symmetry. A telecommunications engineer looking at this pattern will immediately recognize the topology of the broadcasting network and the architecture of the signal distribution system. These stone needles are inserted into the planet's crust at precisely calculated nodal points. This is the acupuncture of the globe. It is the nervous system of a colossal organism, which was once teeming with the flow of energy, and now froze in dead silence. We have reached the most risky part of our considerations, the question of what specific function these stone towers served. Recall the figure of Nikola Tesla, a visionary who proclaimed that electricity could be transmitted wirelessly over unlimited distances. His experimental station Ward and Clive, this characteristic tower with a domed finial, in its principle of operation, is disturbingly reminiscent of our granite monoliths. Tesla didn't invent anything from scratch. He tried to recreate a forgotten technology of extracting electricity from the atmosphere itself. Granite, saturated with quartz and subjected to the pressure of its own enormous mass, behaves like a piezoelectric generator. Metal elements on the tops, that today's people mistake for liturgical crosses or statues of saints, may have originally been wave receivers or emitters. They were resonators. The entire planet could be surrounded by a field of free, clean, inexhaustible energy. Imagine a civilization where there is no need to extract fossil fuels, where light and heat reach every corner of the globe as naturally as air. Where airships, the same Vimanas described in ancient texts, float upwards, pushing against the electromagnetic field generated by the network of these stone towers. It was a golden age. It was an era that was stolen from us. Why was it stolen? Because free, energetically independent beings cannot be tamed. If you have unlimited access to energy, heat, and transport, you do not need power over yourself. You are not a cog in anyone's mechanism. To turn us into an obedient flock, someone had to first pull the fuse, disconnect the network, destroy the transmitters, and then, when the memory of generations faded, put electricity meters on us and make us dependent on hydrocarbons. We are paying for something that our predecessors obtained directly from the environment. This is the greatest fraud in the history of existence, but this system could not be turned off silently. There's a theory that makes you feel cold. What if this global catastrophe, this great flooding, buried cities, layers of clay over roofs, is a side effect of overloading this particular energy grid? Perhaps a conflict broke out, a war between the powers of that world. Someone has decided to use energy infrastructure as a weapon with apocalyptic destructive power. Remember the mysterious Great Fires of the 19th century. Chicago, London, Moscow, Hamburg. Cities burned to their foundations, and the fire fused the brick and stone, turning them into glassy masses. A conventional fire does not reach such temperatures. These are symptoms of the impact of plasma, precisely directed energy shocks. The columns survived because they were grounded network nodes. Everything around turned to dust and slag. This dust then fell from the atmosphere with rain, covering the continents with many meters of mud. And we, saved or made anew, we scrambled out of this mud. We excavated the first floors of palaces and were surprised that our ancestors built such beautiful basements with large windows. We live on the surface of the cemetery of a great civilization and we use its tombstones as tourist attractions. We stand under a St. Petersburg pillar and do not recognize it as a disconnected induction coil. We are a cargo cult praying before the wreck of a plane that will never fly again. This realization infuriates me. We weren't just deceived. We have been reduced to the status of breeding livestock. Compare the architecture of contemporary housing estates, the concrete drawers in which we exist, with ancient. Back then, man was a creator at the level of gods. Today, a person is a consumer unit, battery cell, statistical raw material. Those who took control after the disaster rewrote the chronology, stretched the centuries like an accordion. They carved up one global organism into a hostile one states and nations, so that we can never unite and reach for what we have lost. Divide and control. This rule has worked reliably for centuries, and the lonely columns stand as a silent indictment. They are the only material evidence that the usurpers were unable to destroy or hide. They are too massive, too visible, too hard. Therefore, a different strategy was chosen. Hide them in plain sight. Call it monuments. Wrap yourself in legends about the genius of Montferrand and the power of Rome. Disguise technology under the guise of art. This is a masterstroke. Want to hide something? Place it in the center of the square and hang a plaque with a date. We pass by. We take photos. We touch the casing of what could be a reactor or an intercontinental relay station and have no idea about it. And here another icy thought comes to mind. What if these devices aren't completely dead? What if they run in minimal mode, in hibernation? What if these granite rods still emit specific frequencies that affect our neurochemistry? They suppress initiative, they slow down cognitive processes and maintain a state of passive acceptance. Quartz vibrations, geometry of proportions, resonance of form are all potential tools of psychotronic influence. We exist inside a huge machine that perhaps keeps us in this semiconscious drift, not allowing oneself to fully awaken and grasp the true shape of reality. We are prisoners of invisible walls, and these elegant columns are the bars of our mental cage. But awareness itself is the first step towards freedom. The moment you look at the column and see a device instead of a decoration, the illusion breaks. The system is losing control over you. You stop being a passive piece of the puzzle and become someone who asks. And questions are the most dangerous weapon that can be meted out in a lie.